starting out with those words of the Apostle Paul. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. If there is any excellence and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Now, as I already mentioned, on the cover of your order of service, you will find an old picture of the stone circle at Castlereagh. Those trees, I assure you, are no longer there. Otherwise, it looks about the same. And I probably don't need to tell you that Castlereagh is old. It's very old, in fact. It's about 4,500 years old. 4,500, yes, 4,500 years. And it isn't as famous or as tall as Stonehenge. But while we were in England, it seemed worth a visit. So my wife Allison and I made a short pilgrimage to the hill that it rests on. We took a 6-mile hike, in fact, from the place where we were staying through the forest and then through farms, a few farms, a bunch of gates. You know how that works. And eventually to the access road before we entered the final gate and trudged across the field and saw the circle framed by the hills and the mountains beyond. Now, we human beings don't actually know a lot about stone circles, but we certainly wish that we did. In the readings about Castlereagh that we heard today, there's a lot of talk about druids. Robert Sears refers to it as a druid's circle, and Anne Radcliffe speculates on their motives. Whether our judgment was influenced by the authority of a druid's choice, she says, or that the place itself commanded the opinion, we thought this situation the most severely grand of any hitherto past. But really, that focus on druids says more about 19th century English romantics than it does about whoever made that circle. Because we don't know what the Druids were like, or if they even existed in the way that we imagine them. And we don't know if their large structures were ancient cathedrals or market squares, or scientific laboratories, or government buildings, or something else. These standing stones were ancient when the Romans arrived, and no one is around to tell us what they originally were. But what we do know is that Castlereagh took a lot of effort to make. Its place and position were clearly researched and predetermined. Sunrise during the autumn equinox, for example, appears over the top of Threlkeld Knot, which is a hill about 2 miles to the east. And some of the heavy stones were aligned with the midwinter sunrise as well. And we know, as our reading points out, that the place itself is awe-inspiring. When we stood in that spot and looked out into the valley, bordered by a number of spectacular peaks, it was hard not to be impressed by the natural splendor around us, just as those ancient fellow humans must have been. And while we do not know much, and much of what we think we know is probably wrong, it was worth the walk. It is worth a pilgrimage. It is worth a pilgrimage, for whether the site was selected and built by a mystical priesthood for specifically religious reasons, or set up as a meeting place and a trading area, or a combination of these things, what it is and what it might mean, it is worth approaching in prayer and contemplation. For it is a place where people, more like us than not, attempted to make sense of the mysteries of the world, the mysteries of their lives, and of their place in creation. It is worth a walk to honor the meaning makers at a place like that. The meaning makers of a time so long ago, as we try to make meaning for ourselves in the midst of the same mysteries of life and faith. ancients were not the only ones who left us mysteries. We are here, a week away from Palm Sunday and the beginning of Holy Week, where we think about the resurrection. About the resurrection, what it is and what it might mean for us today. We too are trying to make sense of our world with its cycles of seasons of birth and death and rebirth, at least metaphorically and possibly literally. Grounding ourselves in something more than fact, because there is more to life than what we perceive with our basic senses. Now, of course, Easter has a connection to those older traditions, I think we know. The holiday shares a name, in fact, with an Old English goddess. And its traditional rabbits and eggs have more to do with the mystery of birth and spring than they do directly with the life and ministry of Jesus and the church. Even on Easter morning, those of us who will rise to greet the day at sunrise, and I hope that some of you do, those of us who rise will be making the same sort of pagan observation that would be familiar in type, if not in specifics, to those folks at Castlereagh so long ago. And this is the way it's always been, this holiday we are celebrating. As with most similar things that address the deep questions of existence, it's laid, this holiday, upon what has gone before. Those cathedrals we talked about last week are built on the ruins of previous churches and pre-Christian temples. And so we today will find that some of our foundation stones were laid at places like Castlereagh. Laid down in a time of magic and of wonder when, just as with today, the answers to life's deepest questions come from the telling and retelling, interpretation and reinterpretation of stories, of legends, and of myths. But today, relying on the nuances of these tales has become difficult. Human beings are not reductionists by nature. But increasingly, this is what we are encouraged to be in our regular lives. Society asks us to give up on that wide view, the great standing stones, the beautiful cathedrals, to break them into component parts, to not focus on the beauty so much, but on the veracity and on the utility. Is there coal in that hill? That's the kind of question that our system wants to know. Now, we resist this, of course, but even so, we are the product of our world, and there are those of us who have trouble in our journeys when the presence of concrete fact out of necessity gives way to the power of story and metaphor. It can be disorienting. In our normal lives, there are so many facts that we have decided to agree upon so that we can get our mundane work done. Like how once a year, we decide that what was 10 a.m. on Sunday is really 9 a.m., and then we change it back so that we can rise with the sun. But we need things like this. We need things like schedules and appointments and all that material culture to go about the business of living. But in our spiritual lives, we are seeking the transcendent. We are seeking the transcendent, and we cannot do that by making use of increasing finitude. The transcendentalist James Freeman Clarke once observed that we are either progressing or retrograding all the while. There is no such thing, he says, as remaining stationary in this life. There is no such thing as remaining stationary in this life. We are, at least from our admittedly narrow perspective, constantly learning, constantly changing. And these big questions with their big answers may always contain the truth. But how we experience these truths changes as we too change. confusing, even irresponsible or rootless, to accept that there are things in life that will remain a mystery, to build on universals rather than particulars. But, says Clark, all the strength and force of humanity comes from faith in things unseen. All the strength and force of humanity comes from faith in things unseen. So what do we do? How do we make sense of the great mystery, even though we know or suspect that just like with the Druids, we'll get some of those details wrong? Now, fortunately, at least in the spiritual life, the details, the doctrines, and the orthodoxies we make to bring order to something much grander than ourselves, those details are not what are important. What is important are relationships, relationships with each other in this room and beyond, and our relationship with those universals, with the divine, however we may choose to perceive it. And for that we have a simple path, a simple exercise, even if it is difficult to follow it all the time. It is, in some sense, the same exercise that the builders in Castlereagh had in mind. And there are a number of different permutations and ways to mark that path. But I am fond of the one that we opened with today, from Paul. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, think on these things. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, think on these things. Here we are charged to seek certain universals that lead to the ultimate good. And these universals are not burdened by the specifics of systematic theology, but represent ideals that any of us from any culture or faith can use to set a beacon for our journey through this life. No doubt some of the specifics of what is good and what is just have changed over time, but I don't think it's changed as much as many people believe. The point and the purpose is the same. The point and the purpose is the same. To look up and out from the ground where we stand, to note and admire what is grand and beautiful in the view before us. In the words of the 121st Psalm, to lift up our eyes to the hills, from whence cometh our help. And then to continue the pilgrimage of our lives, to continue the walk of faith toward the commonwealth of heaven, toward that better world that we and the ancients imagined.